Welcome to BookEnds, online edition, produced by the Wadena County Historical Society and Travel and Storyseller in collaboration with New York Mills Regional Cultural Center. BookEnds is made possible by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Five Wings Arts Council, thanks to legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. BookEnds programs from previous authors are now available on the website of the Wadena County Historical Society at www.wadenacountyhistory.org. Today's program will also be available on the website shortly. Next month's BookEnds will be held Saturday, June 10th, 2023. Sorry, 2023. This year at 11:30 and will feature Philip Hunsicker, author of the book The Old Crocodile Man Theory, in a live performance here at the Wadena Depot. This month, Nicole Kronzer will talk about her young adult book, The Roof Over Our Heads. If you have questions for today's author, feel free to let me know. Now let's welcome to BookEnds, Nicole Kronzer. Welcome.
Hello everybody on Zoom, and hello everybody here in Wadena. I'm so happy to be here. My first book, which is Unscripted, launched in April of 2020. So it was a month into this little thing called the global pandemic, and I had all of these events planned and readings, and I had planned a whole book tour. And of course, this had been like my little girl dream, right, to be an author, and so all of it was canceled. And it was incredibly disappointing, of course. But I also teach high school English, and so I saw seniors that year. And I sort of felt like we were going through a parallel situation, right? That like they had dreamed their whole lives of like going to prom and getting to graduate and, senior skip day. And of course they got none of those things, yet they kept going, right? Like they still got to graduate. I still got to put a book out into the world. And so in that moment, like being a teacher and being an author, like both of those things just dovetailed in this really beautiful way. So Unscripted was, quite a whirlwind. I was 35 before I started taking myself seriously as a writer, because in my head, I thought, I don't know where this came from, something in my childhood. I thought you had to live in New York City in order to be an author. And I was really grown up before I realized that just wasn't true. And it was because I was teaching high school English, and my librarian kept bringing in all of these authors, and I was meeting them in person, and I was like, none of these people live in New York City, and a lot of them were teachers like me. And I just realized that like, well, maybe I got to try this thing too. So I sat down, I tried to write a book. And then one of those authors that had been coming, that came to our school, she and I had really connected. And then she came back around again for another book a few years later. And I was like, Nina, this is Nina LaCour, Prince Award-winning Nina LaCour, but at the time she was brand new Nina LaCour. And she said, send me your book and I'll give you feedback. And then, then I'll tell you what you need to do. Oh my God, there's actual trains here. This is like Historic Society, Wadena, will be at the depot. I was like, oh, how romantic. That's amazing. Southwest Minneapolis, and that's right in the flight path. And so like when we have the planes going over, we just pause. We all just know. We just pause, and then they pass, and then we keep talking. What do we do? Do I keep talking, or do we pause and acknowledge the trains? Okay. Oh, you're a train person. Here, also sounds like one to me. When my children were really little, like, and they couldn't read yet, but they would see these planes flying overhead, and then my stepdad kept teaching them what the symbol on all the tails were, and so like they'd fly over, and my tiny people would be like Delta, United, yeah.
They're about 65 or 70.
Really? Love the train. All right, well, I'll keep going, because otherwise we might be here a while. Oh, there's the end. That was worth the drive right there. Incredible. You have to wait. Stop. Oh, and then you really do have that conversation about being on the wrong side of the tracks. Is the train and being on the wrong side of the track? Okay, let's see. Where was I before the train? Right, authors, right? So Nina, right? Nina's like, right, yeah. Send me your book. I will give you feedback, and then I'll tell you what you need to do in order to get a literary agent. And I was like, literary agent, like it was just enough that I was sitting down and trying to write the book. I really didn't think about what might happen after I did that. So to make a long story short, I tried to get a literary agent with that first book, and I got some really nice rejections from agents. There were a lot of people that said, oh, I really like your voice as a writer, but nothing happens in this book for 40 pages, and your protagonist doesn't really want anything. And the embarrassing thing is I'm a creative writing teacher, right? Like, I know these things. And it was a moment where I discovered that the separation between telling someone how to write and being able to write are really different. And I was talking to my dad about it, and so I'm originally from Eau Claire, Wisconsin. He's a big Packers fan, and he's like, Nicole, it's the difference between me on Monday morning saying, oh, all Brett Favre had to do was, like find the receiver, and then like me being the guy out on the field trying to be Brett Favre. Like, those are two entirely different things. And then I felt a little bit better. But I learned so much after writing that first book. And what Nina had said to me is, as soon as you start, so it's called querying, like you write this cover letter and then you send some of the pages. And she said, as soon as you start querying agents, start writing your next book. And I thought that seemed bananas. Like, I had worked so hard with this person, I want to see it through, right? She's like, just trust me. And so this time around, I knew I needed a protagonist that wanted something. I knew I needed action right away at the beginning of the book. And so I started writing this book about this girl who had Saturday Night Live dreams. And she went to this improv camp in the mountains of Colorado. She wanted to make the top team, and she did. But she's the only girl to make the top team. And then it turns out she's the only girl to make the top team in 15 years. And so she finds herself in this sort of like den of misogyny. And the question that Unscripted asks is, when you're trailblazing, how much do you owe yourself because she's miserable and she wants to quit? And how much do you owe the people that you represent? Because she feels like if she quits, she's letting down girls and women everywhere. And then, of course, there's also these really cute Boy Scouts across the road at the other camp. So it's funny and it's scary and it's romantic, and that book sort of came to me because I teaching high school English, and I was teaching like, I think it was like a lot of 9th grade at the time. But then also creative writing, so that's 10th through 12th graders. But I had all these girls coming to me at that time, and they were telling me about their terrible boyfriends. And they would say things like, well, he doesn't want me to hang out with my friends anymore, but that's okay, right? Because that's what it means to be someone's girlfriend. Or he gets mad at me and he yells at me, but then he always apologizes, and so I should forgive him, right? Or the worst was when they would be like, well, he wants to know where I am all the time, and so he makes me take photographs of where I am and text them to him, but that's because he loves me, right? And I would grip these girls by the shoulders and say, honey, you are in an emotionally abusive relationship. And they would be like, no, I'm in honors English. Things like that can't happen to me. And I wanted something that I could hand to a kid and be like, look, abuse is insidious, and like, smart has nothing to do with it, but it is cyclical and it is recognizable if you know what to look for. So here's what to look for. And so even though this book came out and I didn't get to follow it around the country and be like, hey, it has had a really amazing journey. It was a finalist for a Minnesota Book Award in 2021, which was just so special to me. It was on a list for the American Library Association Best Book for Teens. It made the Chicago Public Library. They put 20 books on their best for young adults, and this book made that list. And then it just came out in paperback in December, and not every hardcover gets to come out in paperback. So that felt like a real win for Zelda. Her name is Zelda and me. And the other funny thing I think about Unscripted is I didn't know this book was going to be a book, right? And so it is like the purest version of my heart. Like there's so many people in here who are named after real life people in my life. You know, my best friend Karen is in this. I've got my friend Ricky, he's in here. A ton of people from school, some of my favorite students, like just everybody's name means something in this book, because it was like, well, I don't know, whoever's gonna see this. And by the time I sat down to write, like, I was just like, I was much more aware, you know, like that this book would be out in the world. And so it was such a gift, you know, and I've heard people say that with your first book, it's never going to feel like that again, because you can never fool yourself into sort of writing in this little cave that you just think might only be for you. You can just never get that feeling again. And it is true. Stephen King has this really wonderful book when you talk to authors and you say like, well, what are books about writing that you really love? And everybody says On Writing by Stephen King. It's just this gem of a sort of a how-to manual. And he was also a high school English teacher, by the way, before he was Stephen King. And in this book, he talks about that you have to write with the door closed and you edit with the door open, right? And so you have to create the book and really believe like no one is ever going to read it. And then when you revise it, then you are thinking about who's reading it. And it is much easier said than done. So one of the things that I do when I write is I write my first version in a notebook, like I just handwrite it in a notebook, because it makes me know this isn't the last version. There's no way my agent is going to take a notebook from me and try to sell a notebook, right? And so it is a trick that I've brought into my classroom and that I suggest to students. Start, you know, long hand out that first version of whatever it is you're writing, because you're going to have to type it up. And in the typing up, you automatically revise it. And in the handwriting, like you just know it's only for you. That being said, I got pretty stuck when I was writing Groove. This is that, you know, famously musicians go through this. Their sophomore album, right, is a tricky one. Second book problems. There's like a whole hashtag on Twitter, second book problems, right? It's that second kid where some things are easier with that second kid, and then some things are a lot harder because you think you know what you're doing, and then you don't know what you're doing. Because every book is its own thing. So this book came from my students and my teaching experience as well. Two things. One, like I said, I teach creative writing, and my creative writing 2 class, so my advanced students, one of the things that I was noticing is that none of them ever chose to write historical fiction. And I love history so much. When I was deciding to be a teacher, it was really a toss-up if I was going to be an English teacher or a history teacher. But then someone told me everyone has to take English all 4 years. There are more English teacher jobs than history jobs. And I was like, all right, well, I was teetering, like, whatever, I'd like a job. So one of the things that I do with those creative writing students is we research Minnesota in the 1890s, and we research James J. Hill. Right here, there he is. We research James J. Hill and his family, and then we take a field trip to the James J. Hill house. We walk through the Hill house and we ask the docents a million questions, and since my students have been researching, they know everything about the Hills and everything about the 1890s in Minneapolis, and they blow the socks off these docents at the Hill house who are used to teenagers sort of coming through and being like, yeah, it's an old house, cool. My students are like, we know that James J. Hill could only see out of one eye because of a bow and arrow accident, but who shot the bow and arrow? And so it makes me so proud as a teacher, right, to like watch these students that think that they're going to have a boring time with history, and then really to make it come alive, right? Because you walk through the Hill House, it's 33 or 36,000 square feet. At one point, it was the largest privately owned home in the state of Minnesota. And, when the Hill House was, first it was given to the Catholic, the Archdiocese. and like nuns lived there and priests learned to be priests, and there was, you know, some like religious education for a while, for like, I think like 30 years. And then the Catholic Church either gave it or sold it for a very small amount of money to the Minnesota Historical Society in the 70s. And so they like took down all the drop ceilings and, you know, like they restored it back to what it looked like in 1891 when it was built. But there were many Hill children. There were 10 born and 9 who survived to adulthood. And so when their parents died and the house was like pretty old fashioned and none of them wanted it, they all split up everything, right? Like, and so slowly, these things are coming back to the Hill house. And every time you go there, there's a new desk, or, oh, here's a painting that's been restored, you know, to its rightful place. And it's such a special thing. The house sort of continues to be reborn. And of course, I've been there many times with students. So we research the Hills, we tour the Hill house, and then they come back and then we write historical fiction. And it is so much fun. And it was so fun for me as a teacher every year to go back to the Hill house and to see my students create these stories that were like James J. Hill Vampire Hunter, you know, or they would like turn all of I can't remember how many fireplaces there are. I think there's like 20, maybe there's more than that, fireplaces, so many fireplaces, and they were like, they are all time travel portals. They would go different places. So, you know, I think in my head, what I thought was going to be historical fiction was like, okay, I'm going to take, you know, Catherine Hill and figure out what was the thing that really killed her when she was 11 months old, you know, but no, they just had these like wild ideas. So when it was time for me to write the second book, okay, so that's in my head, right? Like, oh man, I just love the Hill house. I love historical homes. And I've been to many, you know, every time I go to a new city, I'm like, is there a historical home I can tour? Because there's something about the United States, like, this space is so special, right? Like when you stand in this space, you can imagine what it would have felt like, you know, decades and decades ago. There is a sense of the people that used to pass through here, but we have so few spaces in the United States that feel that way. When you go to Europe and you go to other places that are just older, right? You walk and stand in a castle that was built in 1100 and you're like, ah, you know, but we just don't experience that in the US. And historical homes are one of the few places that we do feel that way. And they're also like largely female spaces. They're spaces that were taken care of by women. And so that is also what makes them so special to me, is not only to feel history in the US, but also to feel like the history of women in the United States. Okay, so there's that on the side. The other thing that was happening with my students is I was teaching a lot of seniors by this point, and they were telling me what they wanted to major in college. And they were things like, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a lawyer, I'm going to be an engineer. And these were like kids that were like musicians, and they worked at after school elementary, like, you know, like the after school program, and they loved to cook. And I was like, okay, cool, but do you like, you know, medicine / math / arguing? And they were like, no, but I think that's what my family wants me to do. Thank you. Yeah. It's like, boy, there's just nothing worse than ending up in a career that is just gonna like strip your soul away, right? So I thought that this notion of a story about a kid who was an artist, you know, in a family full of sort of mathematicians and scientists has been told, and told well. And I also wanted to normalize a life in the arts. And so I took these two things, the James J. Hill house and a kid who desperately wants to fit in with his family. And it is a family full of theater people. So he has two moms. One of them is an actor. The other is a director. He's got two brothers. They are both going to college for musical theater. And then there's our protagonist, Finn, and he's 17, and he just desperately wants to be an actor like his family, but he just can't memorize lines. And so this book, The Roof Over Our Heads, takes place in the James J. Hill house. I totally stole it. If you look at a picture of the Hill house and you look and you see the artwork that Andrew Hudson, the UK artist that did the cover, did, it's the same. And I renamed it, though, cleverly. It's called the Jorgensen House. But if you walk through the James J. Hill house and you have read my book, every detail is the same, except I had to flip had to flip the second floor. Like there was one moment when my editor was like, I think if we use the exact hill layout, we could get in trouble. And so if you're really a Hill House person, you'll be like, that's not where the ballroom is. But I had, you know, I had to make a little change. But anyway, so the family lives in one wing of the James J. Hill House. The Jorgensen House. They live in one wing of the Jorgensen House, and it is owned by the Beauregard Theater, which is a fake theater, but it's essentially the Guthrie. And so the Beauregard has gone through a change in artistic director, and the old artistic director loved that they owned this house. It had been donated, right? And just loved that they owned it, but the roof starts to leak. Just as this new artistic director starts to take over, he cannot figure out why they own this giant, expensive piece of property, and he wants to sell it. But this, of course, is the only place his family has ever known, right? They've been caretakers of this space for 20 years, the only house they've ever known. And so since they're theater people, they gather up their friends, they dress up everyone like it's 1891, and they put on a play. And the play is called A Midsummer Night's Art Heist Garden Party Escape Room Murder. It is a play that you follow as an audience member, you are a silent, invisible guest, and you follow whoever is interesting to you from room to room of the house. And while you are there as an audience member, there is a murder that happens and an art heist. And you have to solve collectively as an audience, you have to solve the murder, and you have to figure out who stole the painting. Otherwise, you as an audience do not get to see the end of the play. And I really wrote the whole play. I wrote the whole thing because I got stuck 9 chapters into writing this book, and I was like, I think I'm just gonna write the play. I'll write the play, and then I'll come back, and it totally worked. It totally unstuck me. So that's the play they're putting on. Meanwhile, they also have decided like what they want to do with the house is host these historical reenactments, right? So you could come to the Jorgensen house and you get to dress up like it's 1891, and you get to live like somebody, like a Victorian, you know, like someone in the Gilded Age in Minnesota for a long weekend. Because as we are in history, we appreciate history. We understand our place, and it makes us feel both smaller and more important, right? Like we have a responsibility to each other, just as people in the past had a responsibility to us. There are choices they made that affect us now, and there are choices we are making that affect the future. And so history is not just about looking to the past. It is also understanding where we are in the grand scheme of things. So Finn cannot memorize his lines. And of course, his nemesis is there, and his crush is there, and everyone is living like it is 1891 for 2 weeks for the run of the show. I had the most amazing time writing this play, or writing this book. I had to research a ton of research about 1891 and Minnesota because everybody's wearing clothes, right? Like the women are all in corsets and the men are all in so many suits. And then right there's this mystery going on. They're also hunting for treasure. I didn't even mention that part. It's bananas. This book basically has everything I love in it. It was like I thought I would never get to publish another book again, and I just put everything in this book. And knock on wood, I'm not supposed to touch that. So where's more wood? Right there. Oh yeah, okay. Right. All right. I hope this is not the last book I ever get to write, but it is really fun. It is really fun. So the thing that these books have in common, they are both theater kid books, but they are not, of course, just for theater kids, right? Like theater kids for me are sort of a stand-in for anybody who feels like they don't belong, because theater was a place for me as a kid that took me in, right? You have a role. It is a defined role. And so you can't help but not fit in. And so that is always the struggle with my protagonists, is trying to figure out their place in the world, and you know what they're supposed to do, right? And the other thing too with these books, what I feel so strongly about writing young adult is because I have teenagers in my life every day as a teacher. And so the issues that come up with them that I recognize were issues with me, I can sort of like hold the hand of my past self and current students. And then I feel like all of that is trying to help other teenagers that I'll never meet. So it is just my absolute pleasure to be able to do both of these things. So I was, you know, like teaching full time for many years, and then now I teach half time, and then I write half time. And that is heaven now, because I get to balance both of these things. And people ask me a lot if the goal is to like quit teaching someday and write full time. But I did write full time. I had a sabbatical for a year, and then the COVID year, I took a leave of absence. So for 2 years, I wrote full time. And I learned as an extrovert, in case you can't tell, it's just not for me. I really missed people, and I missed the kids that I was writing for. And so being able to teach and to write is just absolutely the dream. And I'm living it. So so that's me, and those are the books. So thank you so much for having me. Does anybody have any questions?
What were some of the favorite books that really influenced you as a kid? Do you remember like the first book that made you go, ooh, this?
I mean, I know what you're supposed to say, right? You're supposed to be like, well, I read Pride and Prejudice when I was 9 years old. It was the Babysitter's Club. I loved the Babysitter's Club. I read all of the Babysitter's Club. I really credit actually like my development as a writer as a child by writing Babysitter's Club fan fiction. And fan fiction is a super great way to become a writer, because it's sort of like writing with training wheels. The characters are already there. You might make up some new ones, but like the world already exists. And so then what you're doing is taking this sort of existing thing and then playing with it, right? So yeah, Babysitter's Club. I also read a lot of historical fiction, because when I was a kid, there wasn't a lot of YA yet, right? Like we had, you know, there was like Sweet Valley High, and there was the Babysitter's Club, and then we had, you know, Nancy Drew was sort of getting a resurgence. But in terms of like the explosion of young adult literature now, that just wasn't there in the 80s and the 90s. And so yeah, it was a lot of Scholastic Book Fair. And then yeah, so much historical fiction. I just loved it. Oh, and Mary Higgins Clark. I read so much stuff that I shouldn't have been reading, you know, at age 10 and 11 and 12. Like I should not be reading those murder books, but I did, and I'm okay. Right. It does make me want to write a murder mystery. I mean, you can see I put a little murder, you know, in here. Oh, and another fun thing is always I keep mentioning Murder, She Wrote in like always. Like, my God, I grew up watching my mom watch Murder, She Wrote, and there's this like comfort place. And then of course Angela Lansbury was an author, right? So she's always like poking away on that typewriter. Oh my gosh, I just love her. Love her. That's a great question. I should also come up with the erudite answer. You looked like you had a question, but did I make that up? No, okay, I made that up. See? Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh. That is an amazing question. Yes, I am everyone. You know, as I'm writing the book, it is almost meditation, because I just am someplace entirely, right? Like it's of course my brain is working very hard, but I'm just someplace else. Like the things that I wrote during the pandemic, during George Floyd, helped me, right? Like they took care of my mental health, because in the world that I was creating, I got to control everything. And I got to decide what people said and what happened to people. And so there is some level, right, that like that was me getting to experience those things. Oh, because our brains are fascinating. This is another thing that I learned when I was in graduate school, you know, teacher graduate school, that our brains, okay, you know, as teachers, we're always telling students like, oh, appeal to our senses, right? Like as you're writing, you want to use like concrete things that make us hear and smell and taste and touch what, you know, what blah, 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 as you're writing a poem or whatever. But then I learned the reason why. So as we move through the world, our brains take in things through our senses and they process them in the limbic system of our brain. And then the limbic system translates them into sensuous responses in our body. And so, like, let's say that you have a crush on someone and they walk past you. You see them, you hear what they say, you smell them, maybe you reach out and you touch their shirt a little bit, you're not gonna taste them because that's not okay at this point. But you take them in through your senses, and then, maybe they're like, hey, how's it going? And then you're like, oh, right? Because your heartbeat, right, is beating really fast, and then your palms start to sweat, and then like your stomach is turning flip-flops, and then you can't walk, right? All of those things are sensuous responses in our body. But like, then if I go to my friend and I'm like, oh my gosh, Lina, I saw, like this person I totally have a crush on, and is Lina gonna feel exactly what I felt? No, not at all, right? Because I've used this shortcut word. Like, I saw this person I have a crush on, but that's not an emotion. And even if I say the word, like, I love this person, Lina's not going to feel what I felt. And so what we have to do as writers is reverse engineer feelings. Fascinating, right? And so if I say to my friend, oh my gosh, my stomach was like flip-flopping around and I couldn't walk and my palms started sweating, and also I smelled this smell and it was like bergamot and clove, and it just like filled my senses and my whole face was like, ugh. And then I said, hey, right? Now, Lina's not going to feel exactly what I'm feeling, but you're feeling something. Yes.
I had a workshop in New York Mills, in the social center, many years ago, and the speaker was the Raymond comedian, who was an incredible novelist. And he talked about the third word as a low bias studio.
Oh, that's fascinating. A low bias medium. Yeah. Right. Because so you're feeling a thing, even if it's not exactly the same thing, you're feeling a thing. And the reason that works is because our brains are a little bit stupid. And there is a part of your brain that doesn't understand that it's not actually happening to you. And so the same part of our brains lights up when we spend time with friends as when we watch episodic television of the same people over and over again. So like the show Friends and having friends, the same thing. Like the same part of your brain is like, oh, that was nice. This is why reading works. It's the reason why you can fall in love with a fictional character. It's the reason why you cry when you're reading about not a real person, because our brains think it's happening to us. And it's also beautiful. It's also then the reason why if you watch television shows about people who are different than you, it makes you more empathetic, because your brain thinks that those are your friends. It's why, like representation in novels is so important, because when kids read about people who are not like them, it makes them nicer, and science proves this. So I can't remember how we started on that, but like, yeah, and like, yeah, right. Do I feel like I'm those people? Yes, and then I hope you feel like you're those people too. Yeah.
You were talking about how you felt it changed Daniel. Have you been to Glensheen?
Oh yes, I have been to Glensheen. In fact, I'm working on a novel right now that takes place at Split Rock, up in just north of Grand Marais, or sorry, south of Grand Marais. And in the book, I have them go to Glensheen. So I need to go to Glensheen a few more times in order to have that. She's a carpenter, and so this is a novel for adults, and she's a carpenter, and she's never been to Glensheen. And her friend is like, that's impossible. Like, how can you build houses and never have been to like the most majestic house within 100 miles of you? Yeah, oh, I love Glensheen. Yeah, I also got to study. I got to stand at the Ramsey House, and the really great thing about the Ramsey House, if you've ever been there in St. Paul, is Alexander Ramsey, who was like not a great guy, but knew that because he was governor of Minnesota, his house would be a museum one day. And so he just instructed everybody, like, if we ever redo a room, just keep everything and put it in the basement. And so literally when it was handed over to the society, the Historical Society in the 70s, they like open up a box that's like living room, and it's everything. So you walk into that house and it looks like the Ramseys just stepped out for a minute. Unlike the Hill House, which is entirely, mostly empty, right? But the Ramsey House is like the dishes that they had, like the moose head on the wall, like everything is theirs. And so they also have a wood burning stove that works. And so I got, and Finn loves to cook, right? Like, so he had to learn Victorian cooking. And so that meant I also had to learn Victorian cooking. And so I got to stand in the corner one night as like the tours went through. And then they also have like, actor docents. And so someone is pretending to be the cook and they're like, oh, welcome, Mrs. Ramsey just stepped out, but here are some cookies and who has questions about my beautiful kitchen? And so I just stood there in the corner and I took notes. I learned all about the wood burning stove and about how hardwood burns more consistently and longer, and about like the way that the air has to get like, drawn down and then it has to settle and then get drawn back up. And there's this like handle and the thing back to begin, front to finish. I learned that, there's no gauges on those wood burning stoves. And so you stick your hand in the oven and then and you stick it in there and you start counting. And if you can count to 3, it means that, without like hurting yourself, it means that the oven's about 300 degrees. So for every second you stick your hand in the oven, it's 100 degrees. How did anyone eat anything? That was marvelous. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure it out. As a teacher and a writer, a lot of stuff is happening now in regards to like banning books, going around schools and things like that. And so how do you deal with it?
Yeah, I mean, it hurts me, right? So there's this line a lot of authors are saying that like, look, you get to decide as a parent what your kid reads and what they don't read, but you don't get to decide that for other parents. But then there is the counter argument to that like, there are some books your kid might need to read that you don't want them to read, but they do need to read that book. And it's, so it hurts me. It's something that I feel like my middle ground is like the line that I think that I can say and that will do the most good is probably like, you get to decide what your kid reads, but you don't get to decide what other people's kids read. Like, I think that's probably the most palatable line, even though I actually feel even more that a kid should read what they want to read.
Banning books is a great way to get kids to read those books.
Sure, I mean, absolutely. I mean, there's been some really great things like the Brooklyn, New York Public Library. Any child in America can have a free, like you don't have to live in New York in order to have access to all of their ebooks and audiobooks. They just made them available to every kid in America. But of course you have to know that, right? And so like if you're living in a community that's like banning books, you aren't as a kid gonna know, And so for sure, I remember being in high school and learning about banned books, and I was pretty much a goody two shoes, but I was like, I'm gonna read all the banned books. It was like the most rebellious thing that I did, but it was really rebellious to read all of those books that had been banned in places. So that's what I want. I want a kid to read a book if they know that it's banned. But now they're even banning authors. Like Alana K. Arnold, who blurbed this book, right? She's the top blurb here. She has been banned for being, what was the phrase that they use? Basically like a dangerous person. She writes, picture books all the way up to adult novels. And there's places that just aren't carrying any of them, even if they aren't problematic. That's what she is. She's a problematic person. So, and also like pendulum swing, right? And so the thing is like when you push a pendulum in one direction, it is going to get pushed back in the other. And so we are coming for you, book banners, and that's what we have to believe too, is that a thing that we've taken for granted, which is just access to books, isn't something that we can take for granted as a country. And we do need to say to librarians, like, thank you for stocking the books that you think, and speaking up at city council and doing these things to be like, I love the fact that there are books. Books. Yeah, they're dangerous, man. Yeah, exactly.
I think I'm really, in some ways, conservative about Huntsville. I mean, I thought just the day that water for elephants and the last castle, we both wrote those were a church. club.
Yeah.
And I am like, I gotta read them and find out what they're thinking.
Well, and those are books for adults. So then, I mean, the whole argument is that we're protecting children. Then what are we doing banning books for adults? Yeah.
And like these, like, when I like
Yeah.
50, and we were speaking like whitey, because we were doing it.
Right.
And I actually did, but that maybe and reading.
You're a fine upstanding member of society now, though. You know what I mean? Like, it didn't turn you into a weirdo, did it? Yeah. Yeah, Lana.
So, there was sort of the same kind of thing going on.
Mm.
People were going to do this thing, saying, we have to ban these
Oh.
books, we have to ban these books. And so one of the English teachers, they said, okay, it's not going to do it. They took everybody down to the forestry, where the books that they wanted. And there was in school, and it's not in they're all in the video.
Was that around here?
Yeah.
It sounds like some kind of touchy feely nice thing.
Yeah.
It's not.
No.
It's like you take the thing, this actual. And then you think about somebody.
Yeah.
Like,
And you know, the other thing, the other thing about the book banning that's happening right now is it's disproportionately happening to authors of color and, you know, to queer writers. And so what that's also saying to kids is like, you don't exist, right? Like your stories don't exist. And again, what I talked about, right, that we know that when you read about people who are different than you, it makes you more empathetic, it makes you kinder. And if we take away those stories, we're also taking away that empathy. And that's maybe, you know, the most important thing, right? And we're talking about people's careers too. And we can talk about like all of that, like you said, like the touchy-feely pieces. We're talking about real people whose books then are not being purchased. And, you know, like Unscripted was nominated for a South Carolina Book Award, which shocked me. So I was like, South Carolina. But like this got into the hands of thousands of South Carolinian teenagers because it was on that list. So that was book sales for me. And if my book gets banned in a state, Florida, right? Like that's thousands of books that aren't, that's me too, right? And I mean, that's maybe, we, you know, like in a beautiful world when we're thinking about children, we can think about like, well, that's the least important part of it. But we actually do have to make money in order to make art, right? It's so yeah, it's complicated and it's really ugly. And I hope it goes away soon.
they don't really read that. We're not going to put down like your notification and only bookstore, only bookstore for adults. So-
Oh yeah, it's really hard to find books for kids. Yeah, yeah,
Any
books for,
bookstores.
yeah.
Prior that was a certain point.
Well,
Yeah.
I think this topic is applicable to all of the arts too. If we imagine 150 years ago, if the powers that be would ban Tchaikovsky
Oh yeah.
from all parts, all countries or states because he was gay,
Yeah.
how would life be different?
Right.
They didn't have posters, music.
Didn't affect, yeah.
You can't go a half hour of anywhere without hearing snippets.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's
Part of our culture, it's part of our.
it's in the fabric of our, of our humanity. Yeah, and so that's what it is. It's pulling out threads of the fabric of our humanity and saying that they don't belong.
Anybody else have questions?
Well, this is probably off the top, kind of a, I did Baker for many years, and they were like, I just thought that you couldn't, well, there was a book called Rainbow Seal, and so it's about colors. But I wrote a book that was a banned book because it was two guys getting married, and I had some kids reading it.
Yeah.
And I said, what is this book about? They go, oh, she was just really worried that once you're on the period, you don't have to do the spend for anymore. There's nothing from there. They were picked up when
Yeah,
kids to read the story and stuff was not at the 2000s.
Right.
It was like a, you're not be able to take her to all these things to the ballet and all these things.
Right.
But you're like, see, that's not the point of this.
Yeah, yeah. right. Yeah, books can normalize, right? And then that's the other thing that's so dangerous, right? Yeah,
Like along that line, what they get out of the book, like, cause a lot of books are written on some of the adults.
right, yeah.
The book that's like about earlier the American culture, there's some history in there, those different animal characters. There's like things that happen to the mice, and you know right away, oh, those are the Jews. And then
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
and there's these ones, you know, oh, these are the.
yeah. And I imagine you can enjoy the story, not understanding that, but then you layer that in. Yeah. Yeah.
Things are in there.
Yeah.
And so history, I was like, wait.
Ooh,
I read this.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, I don't think, but I don't think see that they just.
Yeah.
Nice.
Right.
Funny.
Right.
And it's affecting. And it's affecting.
Yeah.
You go back and read them in a different stage and you see things in it.
Yes.
I read them for other books. And I understood because of where I lived, we were in the earthquake. So the kid growing up, we just learned all about Native Americans in our area. So I knew what the attitudes were with the as a kid.
Yeah.
To maybe hate them or hate her for that, I just understood, oh, well, they're living there and they were told. You go back and look at the period, actually, the Native Americans were the least of their population, the least likely to kill when they were going.
Sure.
There was just too many other things that were gonna get them first.
Like the weather.
The weather, the journey.
Yeah.
things, all that stuff. So the wagon wheels.
Yeah. Well, I played Oregon Trail, you know. Yeah.
Like now everybody does another strip her of everything because she had some ideas as a leader in life that were actually very common in the larger population through that period.
Yeah.
So it's like, I didn't see those things, you go back and read it and it's like, okay, yeah, I can see where this and this is,
Yeah.
but that was like such a little tiny snippet
Yeah.
of the larger,
Yeah.
story that most kids, I think, would miss that.
It is really interesting, right? Like, because if we're going to say, well, kids are sponges and they soak up everything, we have to be so careful about what we give them. And then we're also saying, no, it's fine. They'll be fine. But then as a parent, like, I purposefully didn't give my kids Laura Ingalls Wilder. You know, like, I read them and I love them. And I don't hate Native American people. You know, like, clearly I'm right. But, like, I did make that choice to give my kids some other books. And so it is a complex issue. But I think that we are not living in a nation of complexity and nuance right now, right? We're living in like, it is yes or it is no. And so if I have to stand on a yes or no column, then I'm going to be like, no, please do not ban books.
Yeah, but I think too, that while their brains are sponges, they
Yeah.
don't process things the same way. And
Right.
anything you don't have any sort of experience and knowledge of, a lot of that will go right over their head.
Yeah.
And I was going to thinking of when I was
Sure, yeah.
teenage
Yeah.
and stuff. And a lot of stuff, you go back and look and go, oh, I missed that. in
Yeah.
this.
Yeah, but you don't have the context for it. Yeah. Tends to.
Like you said,
Yeah.
okay, you're gonna
Yeah.
focus on the, because that's what they're gonna relate to.
Yeah.
Like, how is this gonna be?
Yeah. Right. Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, that's been interesting. My the next thing, speaking of kids, like the next thing my editor wants is a middle grade series, right? So I'm supposed to find My Babysitter's Club. Okay. But she also wants a little bit of magic in it. So I'm supposed to find My Babysitter's Club meets Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants. Whatever that intersection is. And I've been really struggling because I don't teach middle school, I teach high school. And middle grade is actually aimed at as low as 8 years old. So you think middle school, middle grade, but it's actually aimed at ages like 8 to 12.
And then YA, so my books are, this one is rated 14 and up, but I let my 11-year-old read it and she is fine. And then this one is rated 12 and up. But you know, it has these books have 17-year-old characters in them. So we are really, there's very few books being published right now with 13 and 14-year-old characters. So when I think middle grade, like that's what I'm thinking is 13 years old, but I was told that's too old. So now I have to like tap into my plucky 12-year-old, you know, and like figure out what is going to happen there. So that's the next kidlit thing for me, but it has been a struggle trying to figure out what that is. So I was like second book problems, and now we have third book problems.
I'll give you a list of authors you should check out.
Yes, please. That would be amazing. I would really love that.
What would you, you have a little bit of time, I was wondering if you might want to read a book.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So I'm gonna read. Just give me 1 second here. I should have marked this before the thing started. Though. I have a section I like to read. Okay. Oh my gosh, I found it. Okay, so we're in chapter 4 of The Roof Over Our Heads. If you want to follow along there, page 27. Yeah. And we're gonna meet the family. So Finn's moms are named Laura and Naomi. And when his brothers were little, they called them Lola and Nomi. And so they're Lula and Nomi. And so that's what everybody calls them now. And then his brothers are Andre and Kendrick. Trying to think if there's anything else you need to know. I think you'll figure it out. But here we go. Okay. A slate roof can last a long time, like 200 years apparently. But at the ripe old age of 130, ours started misbehaving. I was so glad I happened to come up here to grab the record player for Drowsy Chaperone in March, because after 100 inches of snow this winter, all that snow was starting to melt. And that melt was coming inside. Lula was still recovering, and Jeffrey Thatcher, the beloved Beauregard artistic director who had approved Lula's plan to turn the Jorgensen house into Victorian Disney World, had just passed away. So I didn't tell Lula or Nomi about the roof. They had enough to worry about. Instead, I found buckets and spike tape to mark where those buckets lined up under their particular drip so as to easily replace them in the right spot after being emptied. I decided I'd tell them when Lula was feeling better. I kept using that word when, even though I didn't always trust it, when she could handle things again, when this was all over. Because theater people believe in the power of the spoken word. Belief in that power was probably what kept me from telling anyone at school how sick Lula was. I worried that if I gave voice to the sentence, "My mom has cancer," I would be inviting something dark and terrible into an already dark and terrible situation. So during those months, I said when, not if, and transferred the unwelcome water into 2 orange 5-gallon Home Depot buckets and hauled them down 4 flights of stairs several days a week, where I watered Nomi's plants under the eaves. I could have poured the bucket water down the sink. There was one in the attic, but, and I would never admit this out loud, it didn't occur to me for like a month. And by that time, I was starting to get decent muscles from all that lifting. So the voyage of the buckets continued until Andre caught me the night he came home from college. "You have to tell them," he exclaimed in the servant's wing, shaking me by the shoulders. Doing a double take, he squeezed my biceps. Geez, I guess that's where these muscles came from. Then, perhaps to prove he still had the upper hand, he jammed his arms under my armpits from behind and laced his fingers around the back of my neck, lifting me up off the ground. "Finn," he reprimanded me as I squirmed. "Why are you keeping the leaking roof a secret?" "Because of Lula," I shouted, kicking him in the shin. "She can handle it," he insisted, releasing me. He shoved me, then rubbed his leg. "Together, our parents can handle anything." I wanted to tell him he hadn't seen the two of them fold into each other this year like I had. Lula had been diagnosed when Andre and Kendrick were away at college. She had insisted there was nothing they could do at home, they'd just worry, and told them to stay at school. so they'd stayed. I'd wanted them home. I hardly knew who I was without them anyway. And with Lula being sick on top of that, but when I talked about it with Nomi, she teared up and said Lula did not need the guilt of them missing school on top of everything else. So I didn't tell anyone about the roof. When I finally did, under duress, Lula and Nomi sobbed when they saw what I'd done. You saved the house, Finn, Lula whispered. There's a spot that's leaking in the west servant's bedroom, I said, following her with my eyes as she picked her way around the buckets. That's the only one I haven't been able to find. The ceiling plaster has turned a super gross color down there. I put a tarp on the floor, but Finster, Nomi interrupted, wrapping me in her arms. Her voice was thick and dropped low so only I could hear her. Look at you, darling, she murmured into my hair. Look at everything you've done. All those meals, keeping up with school and shows. You made it so I only had Lula to worry about. And this whole time you've been protecting everything she's worked for, what we've all sacrificed for too. She tightened her grip on me. I tried to resist the tears welling in my eyes. I hadn't cried in front of them once this whole time. But Nomi kept holding me and holding me. And then, well, I'm not a robot. Can I talk about the audiobooks for a second? So when Unscripted came out and we had sold the audiobook rights, I think they were like, hey, we sold the audiobook rights. And I was like, hooray! And then I immediately wrote my agent and I was like, listen, I feel a little embarrassed asking this question, but as a former professional actor, I know every single person in my life is going to ask me if I'm doing my own audiobook. And I would love to do it. I would be willing to audition. Can I put my name in the hat? And my agent was like, I guess. And so she wrote them and asked, and they were like, yeah, we'd like a recording. Can she send a little something in? And so I did, right? I sent in a little recording of me reading it. And they were like, cool, that would be great. Yeah, cool, yeah, really the author, awesome. Okay. So then I start preparing. And is anybody an audiobook person? Do you listen to? Okay, right, okay. So Julia Whalen is my favorite audiobook, record. She's done over 300 audiobooks. And so I was just really feeling like, I don't know, we'll just give it a shot. And so I messaged Julia Whalen on Twitter and I was like, hey, big fan, do you have any advice for me as I'm, an author and I'm doing this for me? Julia knows me not at all. And she was like, send me your email address. I got this email I send my friends, when they're doing their own audiobooks. And so I sent her my email address and then a bunch of hours go by. And then 6 hours later, I get this email that's this long. And she's like, I couldn't find the email. So here it is again. And she wrote it out. She typed out all of the advice for me, which was incredibly generous. And it had some funny things in there. She was like, okay, you're going to read off an iPad. And I knew that. She said, then highlight everybody who speaks in a different color. So you'll know when you have to adjust your voice for the different people. It's great advice. And that is when I discovered that I had 33 individual voices in Unscripted. And then it is a book about improv comedy. And so sometimes those characters are playing other characters. And so many boys. There are so many boys in this book. It's what did I do to myself? So, right, we recorded, I went in, I read the thing, it was incredible. Oh, the other thing Julia said is, after you talk for a while, your mouth gets smacky and it can really get picked up on the microphone. And so the thing that solves that is green apples. So I know they don't really understand it's the acid, I don't know. And so I had to bring a bucket of green apples with me. And then every time I would start to get smacky, the engineer would be like, take a break. And then I'd take a little water and some throat coat tea and then eat some of a green apple. Isn't that nuts? So I record the whole thing. As that's happening, I'm working on Roof, and I knew I was writing this about a boy, and I wanted to do the audiobook for Roof, and so I made the book in third person, so I would still have a chance to read the audiobook, and that is a terrible reason to write a book in third person. And so then when the edit notes came back from my editor, she was basically like, this book would be better in first person. And she didn't say it quite like that. She was like, all of these things need to be fixed. And then I was like, all of them would be better if I rewrote it in first person. And she's like, that is an enormous amount of work. I am not asking you to do that. I was like, I know, but I knew all along it should have been in first person. So I rewrote the entire book in first person, and it was a haul, but it is a much better book because of it. But then it also meant I was like, well, I guess I don't get to do the audiobook. Fast forward, we sell the audiobook rights to the roof over our heads. And, you know, again, Asian Rights is like, hey, we sold the audiobook rights. And they saw that you did your other one and they'd like you to do this one too. And I went, do we all understand this is a first person 17-year-old boy? Like, do we all get that I'm a 44-year-old lady? Do we get that? And I was asking author friends, like, do I write back and say, are you sure? And they were like, no. They definitely would have read the book. They would definitely know. They just, you know, you're the author, you're a performer. And I was like, okay. So we get the booth booked, right? We get the engineer I like I start doing Julia Whalen highlighting, right? And then I get another email that pops up, urgent. And they're like, my agent's like, so they just figured out you're a lady. And this book is not about a lady. And I was like, yes, that seems so minor. And you read the place like right away. Like, okay, how long does it take? Yeah. I don't know, man. Like maybe if somebody, no, it says right here in the bottom of the thing right here, right? 5 years ago in 6th grade when Jay learned that a white guy, like it says guy on the first page. Somebody, they felt so badly. They were like, listen, here's what we're going to do. We're going to give you choices. And so they gave me 4, like, so I get this email in the middle of class one day this fall, and they gave me 4 choices of men reading the first 3 minutes of my book. And I love audiobooks, and they were all men I had heard multiple audiobooks of. These were like award-winning, you know, dude recorders. And I said I felt like the equivalent of like, I was like a used car salesman that had been doing my own commercials for years. And then my people were like, why don't we just hire an actor this time? And then I go, okay. And then they get Samuel L. Jackson. So I have Graham Halstead, who reads The Roof Over Our Heads. And it's so good. It's so much better than I would have been able to do. I mean, he's a man, so it is a man, and there are many men in the book. So right, like that. But then also just like, this is what he does for a living, right? He also has recorded over 300 audiobooks. He wins Audies every year, which is like the Oscars for, you know, for like audiobooks. It's just incredible. And like there was I had one note. And so I wrote back, I was like, I really like Graham Halstead to do it, but I have this one thing. And he was the guy at the audiobook company. He was like, oh, he's really great at taking feedback. And so then I wrote things like this, you know, about like all about the characters and, you know, where they're coming from and how I thought that might affect their voices. And it's just such a dream. Like it's the most beautiful audiobook. So I'm really proud of the one that I did. I think I did a really good job with Unscripted. I think I was the right person for that. But then like the circular trip that the audiobook took for Roof ended up just like on such a positive, lovely note. Yeah.
So it is now 12:30.
We did it. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
And I want to